Hello everyone, today we talk a bit about Hermetic tradition. Again, I recently started this new series. I don't know how successful it is because frankly there is much to be known about it, but also in very contextual terms. It very deeply aligns with our content. As a matter of fact, especially the Imperial Catholic tradition. People do not necessarily know why that is the case, but we will be browsing this further. Essentially, when you look at alchemy, in an early modern context, you realize that great part of this wisdom, right, this traditional knowledge, is a already modern and secular kind of the older universal creed that we expound in our videos, for example, about Indo-European theologies or, again, Imperial Catholic traditional history and more. But it is, as a matter of fact, incredibly useful to show one thing that I think has not been adequately studied, in part because we really don't have enough sources in this sense, namely the survival of this very specific body doctrine across the centuries. Alchemy, for example, was not, antagonized by the same Christianity, right? Even though there were lots of, for example, Protestants at this point that practiced it, and in a sense, like there was a lot of confusion in the world at the time, there's nothing inherently sort of sinister in it. It aligns, and it was sort of, in fact, already at the time tolerated by Catholic beliefs. People believe that, I don't know, at some point Christianity arrived and everybody stopped believing whatever existed before. This is complete, and within the same Christianity. And this is completely nonsensical. I mean, I studied, even like incidentally reading about late 13th, early 14th century medieval European society for my research and so on, for completely different purposes, mostly military in nature. That there, for example, like not just astrology and astronomy, because they were the same thing technically at the time, were very much out there, but there were specific public officials in city-states, for example, that were completely accepted by the local ecclesiastical establishment, as long as, of course, they didn't sort of started to go astray from something that evidently was not much of a problem for Christianity, but probably with the deeper sense of Catholicism that precedes the same Christianity, which is the thing as I always say, like to trigger people with, because it is actually sort of macroscopically self-evident to anyone having a minimal experience in this fields. And that people still say, oh no, because Grok told me that, no, well, this really never happened. But I myself at some point asked to see what's the sort of the state, so to say, of this in sort of quote unquote mainstream, which is a term I hate, knowledge. And yeah, we have unfortunately as successfully removed any trace of traditional knowledge from our culture. And this channel is basically struggling in great part to just restore tradition, because that's something a bit ideal in this day and age, but definitely providing with the material to sort of reaccess at least the knowledge of the fact that this was completely normal up to very few centuries ago, and that it is actually the only key to come back to some primigenial, or in this sense, positive dimension. Today we talk, because we will make hundreds and hundreds of videos about this. I really want to expand this on many other topics. As we started this series on Hermetic tradition, we can absolutely extend everything to many other fields. It depends on how it's going to intersperse, because frankly, I privilege the Imperial Catholic traditional history and the European stuff. That's way more interesting. Next to the topics that partially overlap, for example, in Christian history, we have to fall back a little bit on our more regular so-called cycle topic extraction. And buckle your belt, because in the next few weeks I will essentially make lots of videos of the specials I prepared in the last months for the holiday season. There's going to be a major spoiling as a Never Never Land, like Candyland, Toyland, whatever, right? But at some point we also have to, these videos are very important as a matter of fact, because I'm not talking about today's one specifically because it's part of a much bigger one, but the specials I've been preparing are in any case major cornerstones for a gluing element for all the stuff we've already done. And so the channel has recently surpassed the 30,000 subscribers threshold, which, as I told you, I'm of course very thankful towards you for. And however, the encyclopedical nature of this content and its deep sort of interconnection across all the videos and so on is way more important in many ways than anything else, other than the content itself, the meaning of it, which is deeply traditional in that sense. Now, this video essentially concerns the connection between regeneration and immortality, which is, again, a leitmotif of entire traditional history. You can argue that that's basically the only thing. Like, it's like people like, I don't know, the Trinity wasn't even there in Christianity or in Indo-European theology, like, because, there's not a place in which this is explicit, aside from the fact that there is, like, especially in Indo-Europeistics, but also in the Gospels. But any person making this kind of statements gives immediately away the fact that they have no perspective whatsoever, because if you realize what, for example, just like the Holy Trinity means in a dynamic sense, other than being, just a motto that you can repeat, you realize that the entire concept of, again, achieving divinity through the Holy Ghost, through the messenger, the whole story also of Hermetis Trismegistus, we've seen it recently in the last video about the Hermetic tradition, God as the Father, and of course the Son is the achieving hero into this intermediate dimension. It's all there. Like, it doesn't require any explanation. It's not about finding it somewhere. It's the entire story being about that, right? Can you deny it in front of the Gospels? Even if there is actually, but nothing had been explicitated, right? But do you realize that the entire story is exclusively about this, right? But never mind. And that's the level, again, unfortunately, to which we have fallen culturally, if we can even use the term culture at this point. So this Hermetic tradition initially will be not much of a shocker, but you will say, but why are we even talking about this stuff? I'll try to make it clear. So let's start from this. In the dhyana, or the white stone, or silver, or moon, and similar designations, essentially extracted from the material body known as lead or Saturn, into which that material body has been dissolved, what results is not a body in the usual sense, but instead a universal potency capable of manifesting a soul within a body taken in its widest possible meaning. We haven't covered lead or Saturn. We talked, however, about Diana recently in the video about the Olympians with Artemis. And we explained there that even though she doesn't apparently seem like much of an Apollonian, of a heavenly, sort of particularly Uranian dimension, well, of course, the moon is to an extent, but it's connected, of course, with femininity, with at least the darkness of the night. But as we explained, and this is the great symbol of the Virgin, of the transfigured Great Mother into, in fact, something solar by sort of the same solar reflection of divine light on the moon. This very moon, Artemis, is the symbol, in fact, of the soul of chivalry, of the angel-like woman, the essentially transfigured soul of the victorious hero that allows for for him to sit next to God in heaven. And this is actually a great victory, because not just we've seen also in the video about Na and the sacred waters how the moon herself shines in the darkness, that is the darkness of sin, the one that our blinded spiritual eye does not allow to see further, because it's essentially our own creation. It is one of the greatest achievements of transfiguration, as the heavenly conquest of the chthonic, as a matter of fact. And so there is still a essentially chronic dimension, we could say, literally talking about Saturn, if you know, of course, the parallelism between the Hellenic and the Roman, that is in many ways the instantiation of a especially earthly dimension, at least as a framework of and a pattern of becoming, right? We will talk more about the traditional concepts of time, because again, we haven't talked about Saturn, we haven't done so even for Roman mythology. Instead, it's deeply fundamental. In my next video about Janus, we will see it better. But in this sense, the white stone, in fact, of connected with the moon, with silver, with the astrological sign of Cancer, and the fullness, in fact, also of the season, all right, of the summer solstice, is the purified stone, moonstone, in fact, from this earthly instantiation. It is the moon at its apex in heavenly glory, and it is literally the Virgin Mary in Catholicism. And by the way, we'll talk there. Why couldn't, but also the virgin birth myth is not a myth, as a matter of fact. It's deeply seated also in the Catholic traditional meaning of the transfiguration of the Great Mother. But in any case, we will talk about that on another occasion. So, epurated from this chronic dimension, there is truly a universal potency capable of manifesting a soul itself within a body, taken in this sense in a transcendentally corporal sense, right? And so an instantiation of being completely purified of its own earthly dimension. René Guénon, that we haven't quite discussed much on this channel, but as you know, 1886-1951, was a French metaphysician and leading figure in the traditional school who explored esoteric doctrines across Eastern and Western traditions. I'm not overwhelmingly a fan, but sort of incredibly interesting author. Radcliffe observes that the glorious body, so-called glory, so the transfigured one described, and which is the same ascension of the Virgin, as a matter of fact, also in Catholic tradition. If you have a minimal idea of the references here, not much just in the Catholic tradition, but in what we just said, with a minimal alchemic, hermetic principle here, you understand how prepotently self-evident and macroscopic these beliefs had been for millennia. Well, Guénon described this also from writings that were borderline Christian, of course. There is also a Gnostic tradition. If you think about it, there are many similarities also between Gnosticism and Protestantism. So this doesn't necessarily mean that everything contained in agnostic doctrine is ipso facto like completely separated from the Christian basis. So you can find this information also in other texts that for some reason that was a pretty good one, by the way, because they were actually denying the Catholic tradition, also pre-existing Christianity, still bore much of the same content. By being, again, taken away, we lost some more explicit information about it, regardless of the blatant heresy of those texts. And this evidence aligns with the mention of silver that we also haven't quite explained, nor in an alchemic sense, nor in the various ages of mankind. That is understood, in fact, by Guénon. This is written in L'homme et son devenir selon le Vedanta. This is an old work published in Paris in 1927. But in any case, the quote is the silver is not a body in sort of the transfigured, this transfigured soul that we discussed. It's not a body in the proper sense of this word, but is its transformation, in fact, or transfiguration, as I also would better say, that is the transposition outside the form and the other conditions of individual, and so in this sense understood as human existence, or again, in other terms, it is the realization of the permanent and immutable possibility of which the body is only the transitory expression in a manifested mode. One of the reasons, by the way, I disagree with Guénon, aside from the different reasons, but here, for example, he sort of treats the form just like the human instantiation, And that's not quite the case. The form is, in a sense, probably the transfigured dimension per se. At least it's the sublimation of the same as much as of the same substance. So, in let's say that there isn't a proper transposition outside the form, unless you understand form as a merely sort of lower nature kind of characteristic that gets at least sublimated in, and that would be the better term, into the heavenly one, the perennial one, right? But this is incredibly important because it shows how fundamentally the victory of the heavenly dimension also on the darkest sort of nightly goddess is achieved here. And it could have not been otherwise by the sun. It has a very precise point of taming, possessing, and transfiguring the feminine element. Now, it is precisely from this perspective that we grasp the deeper and authentic significance of the permanence and stability ascribed by Hermetic writings to the new body, in which spirit and body have merged into a single entity, in fact, right? Because the spirit proceeds along the same path. There is no, in fact, that's why Gnosticism there is a bit misleading, because there isn't such a separation, if not in an archetypal sense, between the two, right? Obviously, Catholic tradition, ever since, or the European tradition, is all one. There isn't such a thing like the spirit and the body as separated in some way. There are souls that, however, continue to sort of connect with a body and transfigure the same. We talked also about the doctrine of afterlife. And so there is definitely a reunion between the two. And this is, if anything, what this practically means. And it's as if they had, in a more imperial Catholic traditional sense, never parted, or better, they did, but only in a lower dimension that in the moment in which this reunion is achieved has by definition transcended the earthly dimension, even though it had historically been based on the same. This dynamic occurred from the same earth, right? It's a bit like saying, I don't know, is Christ on the cross dead or alive, right? It's a question that does not make sense, because the achievement had consummatum est had already happened. And so it was, say, both at the same time, if we understand being and becoming as two separated dimensions. So, as I was saying before, when you look at Hermetic tradition, that is very mediated also from this pre-Hellenistic one that we will see more in a circle, because this is just a second video made on Hermetism, and I have to pick specific angles to approach it because it's such an immense thing. But as we were saying before, there is a, say, symbolical instantiation in this sort of materials into the natural world in a metaphorical sense, right? Gold is obviously pure divinity. And so all these alchemic and sort of chemical processes are to be understood, of course, partially in a real sense, because these are the elements of the world that really interact in order to achieve something, but it is sort of highly metaphorical at the end of the day, and it refers mostly to a spiritual dimension. So we can also understand better the sense in which this convergence between body and soul occurs, or even an outright identity and simultaneity, as we just said, between the two paths. Like the spirit taking effect on corporeality and the body acquiring spirituality, a doctrine that is indeed understood also in a agnostic sense, as if the body was merely a negative accident or something you should simply liberate yourself with by essentially killing it, and not as a process of the fall that instead has rendered you in your body and soul like a product of the same sin, right? And in this sense, there is a moment in the fall in which your body takes on a a spirituality only indirectly, as much as it's rather the spirit that also takes on a corporeality. And so there is it's like Mithras initially at the lowest element, like the stone, the most tonic element, that is the one exactly from which the fullness of divinity has to be reachieved to cover the entire universal metaphysical spectrum, right? As we've seen in other videos, for example, one of the Indo-European root word ag, in other videos for that matter, divine inception, a reinception on Earth starts from the darkest of the abyss, and it could not be the same. Hence, also the moon that we just observed. In the darkest of the night, she's the one who is sort of stored properly in divine luminosity by, in fact, sort of solar, the heavenly accomplishment. And we've seen this also recently in the video, for example, about the Dorians regarding, famously enough, the Orestes, the role of Apollo and Athena during the night, the attack of the Furies, and so on, and the restoration of virile law, the rule of the hero, that is also providential wisdom, etc. And so what we see here is basically the same doctrine, but recognized as a clear alchemic precept for the times we can document it in later historical periods. In fact, there is an even deeper concept about how the fall created the world and also the body. The other way around as well. In fact, the spiritualization of the body, let's say, contrary to what a certain materialistic strand of modern occultism assumes, that is very gnostically influenced, does not consist in the body turning into matter of reduced density, right? Akin to transitioning to a gaseous, atomic, or comparable phase. Rather, it involves the body while externally retaining its appearance. This is incredibly important if you think, for example, of the Roman concept of the numen that we just recently discussed, and we've seen also in the videos about sacred royalty, so it's just like looking at a great deity in human form. So what is often misunderstood in this is that there isn't much in fact, materialistic obsession with it. It is true that we'll talk this about probably how we think the fall actually happened, historically speaking, also to counter, for example, to provide at least with a traditional explanation of why evolutionism is actually not wrong, but it happened in the opposite sense, right? That sort of what we see as crawling is the involution of something, not the original one. But this is very contentious, I know, but we will have to expound it at some point because it's incredibly important. So imagine this in symbolic terms, as we can cite from the book of Crates, that is an Arabic alchemic treatise attributed to the ancient Hellenic philosopher Crates of Thebes and preserved we can read at least here, found in Marcelin Berthelot's 1893 collection La Chimie au Moyen Âge, volume 3, says the tincture does not increase the weight of a body in any way, because what taints it is a spirit that has no weight. So in other words, and we explained this fairly well in the video about the doctrine of the two natures, it's not much like the body is something simply, I don't know, dissolving into some, again, Epicurean, let's put it in this way, atomic sense that rises to heaven into something that is all disconnected. It doesn't make any sense. It actually goes against what we think order is. But in fact, there is a passage, because otherwise you would say, well, it would also instantiate something ever more material. That's not the point. The doctrine of the two natures, these natures, while communicant in a metaphysical sense, are not the same thing, right? What you see in this world properly does not have to do with that one. So even though you can understand the soul as a sort of immaterial sublimation, it's not like our material does not contain the soul, nor the soul in this sense has anything to do with our standard of matter to begin with, right? And so the physicality itself is nothing but an hologram of the perennial, eternally existing, absolutely existing divinity. And so the way we experience our own world, which empiricists love so much, and also like modern science unfortunately went largely down the way or the path, the rabbit hole of, is merely something, okay, if it is material, I can verify it because it's minimal here, it's something I can't sort of touch in this dimension, condition, nature of ours, about which, in the latter sense, we do not know scientifically absolutely anything, and that the only sort of explanation of is provided by traditional texts that, again, you can argue again, but we can't measure them scientifically, yes, because as it is explained, that's not properly what our narrow concept of science, actually scientia in Latin, something much higher and obviously transcendental, has at least habituated us to achieve. I'm a great sort of, I don't believe that there is any scientific incoherency, let's say, between what we actually find out and a higher nature as whole. It is actually the proof of the same. It underpins like everything that we can scientifically understand, and this wisdom can increase. There is not really a difference, because here the factor is not the matter we measure, but our attitude towards the same. That it is this latter aspect that we should explore more. And of course, it's as if science had immediately given that up, like just studying it in, I don't know, some biological, anatomical sense, not in a, say, transcendental one. Here I'm not to digress again, it's people's fault, it's not science's fault. I'd like really to see it in this way, unless again you properly distort the meaning of the true meaning of science. So we are avatars of a higher nature. Our reality is imperfect, in this sense, non-fully existing and eternally degenerating. The soul, in this sense, is the only that is baked into the body itself. Like they're not even separated. They're the instantiation of the same being. Can sort of make us return through these, and it's also bodily exertion, for that matter, to the one. So may sound confusing if you hear about this the first time, but it's really not. Like in this context, the body essentially exists solely as an operation of the spirit. You see, Gnostics would say that body was literally created by, it's a conspiracy theory, it's all pure BS for lesser people that were obviously always annihilated the radical fringes of reality. We talked abundantly about what, I don't know, even Catholic doctrine was all about: communism, feminism, veganism, essentially the same concept of transgenderism, your soul trapped in a wrong body, etc. It's the same identical thing, all seen, all done. Like, history is always the same, tradition is always the same. This is all that we need to know in a at least all-encompassing sense. The body is an operation of the spirit, and in this sense, no longer independently based on some accidental cosmic alignment and shadowy forces operating beneath the level of ordinary waking awareness. Also because the more incarnated in this sense, the more materialized, the more subject to a more truly spiritual power we are, right? And so the Gnostic heresy consists in believing that we have to get rid of our body not through a transfiguration of the same, but by literally destroying the body, so killing ourselves. This is communism. This is basic sort of Marxism, also in the inversion of the idealistic. If you look at Marx compared to, I don't know, Feuerbach, Fichte, Hegel, and so it's the same identical thing. But lesser people, of course, that lean by nature towards Gnosticism do not know any better, and so they feel that the terrible Christian God is also just some kind of, it's the evil God, there's a better God, and you have to do nothing, you're just loved for who you are. This is what lesser people always think, like, they have zero responsibility, and so they have to do nothing to save themselves, because literally Gnosticism does not even provide you with an answer with what's the ultimate goal. And in fact, that's also why Protestantism is so is so oddly aligned, even with Arianism, with some heresies that all, at the end of the day, all revolve around the fact that they did not want to accept that only the victorious hero is able to transfigure his mortality, in fact, into divinity, and really do it. Like if you annihilate the concept of works, the usefulness, the direct connection between you and your achievement, that's at least in a unless you're a puppet or something, like you have basically no agency, no relevance whatsoever. This is, again, I find it extremely, extremely important and interesting, because this kind of heresies continued also into Hermetism, at least into those works that fundamentally did not understand this concept, even though alchemy is also much more, in this sense, Catholically aligned than we think. And so in this framework, the body becomes spiritualized exactly where the spirit is able to experience the body as its own direct action, right? You have within you a spirit that can truly use the body in the most extraordinary ways, and it should do so in order as a proof of the sublimation of its own self. So returning also the body to a higher spirit, a bit like Romulus that in a blaze, disappeared in a cloud and was brought to heaven. Like what did happen to the body? Now, that's also why Indo-Europeans cremated. That's why the entire sort of Urnfield culture, incineration, original death rituals of the Roman emperors and so on. It was all about the affirmation of such accomplishment, right? The body was historically also to remain. Even think about the ashes and so on, but it was understood just as a minimal trace of something that had already fundamentally transcended itself. And even when this was not the case, the body was connected with the soul. In fact, that was the fate of the patricians, of the heroes, of those who had fundamentally achieved spiritually the firmament with the mors triumphalis, and so the victory over the second death, so the judgment of the second soul of the being, because the persona died at our sort of human death, mortal, say earthly death, and then the body was part of the somatic trace that came back to the netherworld and the some of the ancestors. But the second soul, that is also the most important one, connected these whole things and would have them reunited in glory, and to the extent at least it had managed to achieve a certain height in the firmament. And that's why also, again, the saints and the military saints, the heroes and so on, are all in the ranks of God's army. It's like the same concept, the volatile and the end time, etc. And it is all, as you understand, overwhelmingly, to say the least, universal, right? The entire Catholic tradition substantiates itself purely in this, across, even beyond Christianity. And so this, when the body becomes spiritualized, this happens exactly at the identical moment when the spirit, through a projection and coagulation, assumes corporeality. In other words, and this is even also in mythology, a divine power can manifest in a corporeal sense as well, because the divine, in a sense, is not some random guy like, I don't know, the later modern secular myths of Zeus that does stuff, right? That acts as a sort of person, like also what Christians criticize, basically what we call paganism, had become about it. They called with contempt, because essentially an act of idolatry, of statues, not much of what they were supposed to represent. And so a crystallization, an ossification, in fact, a materialization of what had to be purely spiritual, it was absolute. And so in the lower nature it can manifest, but out just of divine will, pure will. And so everybody that, even like Christ, for example, that individually had a human nature, that struggle in this sense, is considered not acting because God made him act, or better. God is so beyond, it's so absolute, that whatever happens is because of his will at the end of the day. This can be seen in sort of not necessarily paternalistic terms or predetermined ones, but the proper Catholic interpretation of this is that free will and predetermination coexist. And this is the true doctrine of the two natures. If you think it's just either of the two alone, you're basically not wiring with what these people actually believed in the past, because the same achievement from earth could not happen but through, and this is also the Holy Trinity, the messenger, the Holy Ghost, and the sacred imperium, which was, as the Romans would have called it, a munus, that is to say, a duty but also a reward at the same time. If we really studied our own languages, in their etymology, we would find a very explicitly metaphysical pattern to understand this mechanism. And so this act of becoming corporeal could also correspond to actually not much of a, and I think Christianity is a bit the apex of this, also in the wake of the previous tradition, traditional history and religious understanding of an incarnation that although subject in fact to the laws of this lower nature, and so the passion of the Christ and so on, is actually in itself the absolute manifestation of divinity, the capacity of dying just out of sheer will and winning over death, right, for a broader purpose and mission. And so it's not just like the sort of God simply vindicated Christ or resurrected him for no reason. Christ literally is God as he wins over death, and he had in this sense been divine, partially nature, and actually this we enter sort of more difficult ground in a sense, because also Christianity should be understood in this perspective. There is a spark of divinity within everyone, but in this sense managed to completely defeat the mortal nature, and in this sense also, as you know, there is not a body of Christ, if not in a mystical sense, right? It's not that there's a corpse somewhere. That would be a problem, theologically speaking, because it would mean that Christ did not transfigure. He did. And so this is the proof by God of God that victory over death is achievable. In fact, the same Christianity is not where, okay, well, Christ did it for us. What does that actually mean? God leaves men the possibility of achieving it on their own, which is the full glory, if you read all the ancient myths, of the hero. Hence why people keep dying even after Christ won over death. And that's what the entire Christomimesis is fundamentally all about. Yeah, people that don't even have any minimal theological understanding think that, or at least the ones who want to smear, especially Christianity, as a sort of Jewish byproduct of this Orientalistic, Semitic subjugation to a over, like, they completely ignore what explicitly, not just Christianity, but their own, they sort of people who hate Christianity, talking even here, neo-pagans in mind, do not know absolutely anything about tradition. And this is the complete defeat of even an alleged sort of loss of sort of will to power, or divine capacity among certain peoples. Definitely, there's no doubt that the Semitic war, think about the epics of Gilgamesh and many other had sort of exhausted themselves and lost hope, just like, I don't know, by the Common Era. Basically, in a providential sense, you really need Christ to show a world that by now has forgotten, has at least denied the possibility of saving themselves by themselves, that there is this new show of force. Because this was happening everywhere. It's not like there was an unspoiled world. And actually, the cultures that still believe in those kind of things, the cultures that maintained this at the highest were the Apollonian ones, were essentially the Hellenistic one, the Roman one, way more than, say, I don't know, the Celts or the Germans actually believed by being in the fringe. The origin was the same, but the degrees by which peoples had come to believe certain things or not also depended on their achievements. There's no doubt that the Dorians achieved a huge deal in taking over Hellas compared to whoever remained in Northern Europe. The same goes for the Romans, that reactivate from their Italic background something that overwhelms basically the entire world and sort of fully metaphysicizes the Romanity, in fact, of divinity as well. So this is extremely important, just as much as Christ was had resurrected under Augustus. If one misses this stuff, they have sort of missed practically everything, right? And so this act of becoming corporeal renders the body incorporeal paradoxically. Because, as we've seen in the Numen or in the same Christ, like you have, again, him, like also later after, as you know, the resurrection, he reappears at some point in the flesh to his followers. And so it's this pure proof and confirmation. If you wonder why that is in the Gospels, if you ask, I don't know, the great experts, I don't know, Peterson or whatever, they don't actually know this stuff. Like, it's embarrassing. You have the entire, it would just take some basic comparative diachronic history of religion. Instead, it's just like, oh no, this is a mystery. We don't know. It's all known. We know why that happened religiously, theologically speaking. It's the complete interchangeability, the complete display of divine power. All right. And this, interestingly enough, also eliminates the body as an independent entity as well. As much as at that point that body is God himself manifesting. This is, again, overwhelmingly important. And, when you get this, you don't really look at a crucifix the same way again, right? And just for remaining within Christianity, but the entire tradition, of course, has this repeated over and over again in many other ways. Now, initially, the soul has dissolved itself, attaining that which lacks form or limiting conditions, existing in a state of purity. Once it has achieved this, it begins to recreate forms, conditions, and specificities, essentially whatever it had previously dissolved away from, through its own initiative, ensuring that the fixed persists only as the ongoing active fixation of the volatile. But what in this sense is incredibly important is that there is an active, in fact, intervention of the divine. And, for example, angelic forces, as we've seen, so the divinized heroes in dwelling in the firmament, that continuously intervene in this world, right? They're not merely, okay, we're rich divinity, so we are not doing anything for the lower dimension. Hence, the fullness of divine providence in a way, right? Not even in a way, but in the way. We'll come back to this perhaps in better videos. And this, as you understand, also completely destroys Gnosticism, which is, in this sense, a massive pile of BS, to say the least. Whoever demonizes the flesh in that sense is just a lesser person that cannot accept that victory is achievable. Right? That's all what communism is about, right? The idea that it's better to die entirely because there's nothing to live for at the end of the day. That's what deeply anthropological metaphysical means. It isn't, I don't know, the dictatorship of the proletariat. How would that be? That's Luciferian. It's a lie, right? It's the destruction of any civilization and its right to rule over the world entire by divine mandate and manifestation of sacred imperium. There is a text that is the Filium Ariadne, an 18th century anonymous alchemical compilation drawing on earlier Hermetic sources, providing us with very interesting information because it says this solution is done to reduce the body, which is earthly, to its first matter, that is, the pure state of the force or ether, of which it is the coagulation. And here, again, it speaks in bit too much material terms, but remember, again, it's metaphorical. It is intended in a metaphysical sense. And continues, it says, so that the body and the spirit may be made one inseparably, right? Inseparably. This is also how far, of course, alchemy recognized in the 18th century. So almost major break with tradition, the inseparability of body and soul. It is done to reduce the body to the same quality as the spirit, and then the body mixes with the spirit as the outer word mixes and becomes one with the act of the voice that takes it up again and repronounces it again. This is incredibly beautiful because, as you understand, voice and word are indestructible in that sense. It's truly the difference between the substance and the form, and it really refers to the doctrine of the two natures. And so it's not two things that can mix because they're on two completely different planes, but the higher nature as being inherently superior can dominate the latter. right? While the latter is basically just losing itself and or with a minimal capacity of, so with a minimal rest of that higher nature that is keeping things, that is trying to return to the one. This is again incredibly important. And it says it is done to produce the body, the same quality of the spirit, and then the body mixes with the spirit without ever separating from it, no otherwise than water put into water. There is also a beautiful statement, because it shows again how fundamentally homogeneous the whole source of everything is. To this end, the body is continuing to read, and the first rises with the spirit, and in the end, the spirit fixes itself with the body, right? So the body is in and of itself sacred because it already is the product of the spirit, just like creation is, right? The spirit lives in the body, otherwise there wouldn't be such a thing. It's literally the spirit as the form, right? It's actually very clear linguistic, but never think that the form, if you associate the body with the form. No, the form is the transcendental one. The form is the divine impression. The substance is the body, all right? And so it's the spirit itself is the form that further perfections the body and is able to use it in the way we're saying. This is, again, the proof of how still as late as the 18th century, the imperial Catholic tradition was fully known. And this is, again, of overbearing relevance. The metaphorical nature of the chemical terms sublime and elevate becomes evident from their direct analogy to someone being raised to a position of authority or honor. The augmentation of Augustus Sebastos, and so the divinity. This is, again, very well clear in the original Indo-European etymology of the terms, in the specific vocabulary of the imperial power of religious scriptures. And you find this, speaking again of survival across the ages, also in Arnaldo da Villanova's Semita Semite. This is a 14th century alchemical treatise attributed to the, in fact, this Catalan physician and alchemist who lived between roughly 1240 and 1311. We will see all this better again in other bits, but just remember, this stuff was alive all throughout the medieval millennium, right? And we know, of course, of this through also the early modern period, for which everybody has heard of alchemy and the Hermetic tradition, all this stuff, and all the various esoteric sort of communities and doctrines existing. But this thing had continuously existed within Christianity. It was there, right? We know this at so many different levels of saying Christian literature by Christians, of Catholics, and this was not even the only one. Like, for example, the military had its own that sadly has not been very much saved, even though it had very much to do with this, and in part we'll discuss this, but again, there are, in that sense, more political reasons why it wasn't so evident, but it was, in any case, explained just by the same classical tradition, by the same alchemy, and in all the warlike narrative of Christianity, for that matter. Now, in the case of the body, the aforementioned elevation means acquiring a higher role, aligned with the super individual spiritual principles symbolizing the more precious metals. Super, hyper really means this. It means it quite sort of graphically explains how you can control what is lower but within the same. Remember again that even something smaller than a grain of barley within the chest of man can suddenly expand to encompass the whole universe. Right? It's that gives a hyper real character to the body itself. Hence why also the insistence on not much just the resurrection of the body, which literally means that, as a matter of fact, but it literally means the same, in fact, transfiguration of the earthly dimension. We've seen this also in the video about the Virgilian fourth eclogue, with probably the Indo-European concept of heaven in Augustine times beautifully expressed, right? Everything is transcended by divine superiority. And this is naturally associated with gold, as we've seen. And however, specific metal that it essentially being the immediate step from the fallen from gold, silver is the one that speaks of the highest level of such individual bodily instantiation in the world. In fact, in this sense, this elevation is more connected with silver than gold, because gold just is the most precious. Silver refers to that, and you can find this in the work of Dom Antoine Joseph Pernetti, 1716-1796. He was a French Benedictine monk and alchemist that states regarding this change in his Dictionnaire 45. So even, as you understand here, Benedictines explicitly wrote about this still in the 18th century. This was not such an obscure thing. It was known, right? It was studied. It was well within the Catholic boundaries. This does not involve shifting composites from one natural kingdom to another. It means precisely spiritualizing bodies and corporealizing spirits, which already is something pertaining to the lower nature, for the end of saving the latter. And so, namely, fixing the volatile and volatilizing the fixed for the sake of, as we've seen, intervention. Because you would say, why would you volatilize the fixed? Because it's as if, somebody's drowning, you give your arm you stretch that arm in the water to save them, right? This is the same concept of divine intervention in divinity. And as you understand, this happens by an act of pure will. So while the lower elements, this particles falling from the one, actually volatilize the fixed celestial vault into something, in fact, degenerating, these could not save themselves, and so kept falling, right? Instead, the divine reinstantiates itself, reincarnates itself to save the world. All right. This, again, is very much present also in pre-Christian tradition. This is very clear, for example, in the connection between for example, the ancient rulers. Think about Caesar's speech at his own funeral regarding the fact that they all descended from God. They all came from Mars, from Venus, and from Jupiter back in the root. And we're not talking this figuratively, because if you really look at specific historical figures, even just also partly mythological ones, that were actual kings in a historical time that we think actually existed, the genealogy is very explicit. It all traces back to Zeus in the also best documented Hellenic case, right? But everybody was aware of that, and so this kind of fall could be interpreted also as a form of instantiation for providential reasons, right? Caesar and his fortuna, he exits the res publica, he fixes the world entrusted by God to the chosen people of the Romans, and Augustus receives this as a new golden age. I mean, it's all very providential in nature, and you want to appreciate in this sense the ultimate sort of outcomes of this, such as Caesar becoming a comet in the firmament, or at least still intervening in the universe, but in the heavens. So none of this is casual. None of this is random. You understand how liminal the game is, but how overarching divine power is at the same time. Like, there is a subtle balance, properly the one on which providence hangs, at least in this world, that can be properly reactivated from any point. We talk about it in the video about the traditional meaning of space. In essence, this action is realizing consciousness as body and body as consciousness via the pure act of life, light. All right? Destroying any gnostic statement, right? Body could not be if it had not been created by God. There isn't another source of power but God. One God, not a counter God, not sort of the good God versus the evil God. The body is truly an avatar of the divine. In a similar vein, the term androgynous or rebis is in alchemy often employed to indicate the fusion of the two natures across different phases. It should not, with respect to the specific context, suggest the presence of two separate substances or principles compared to distinct objects. In this sense, we'll get to the mythos of the androgynous, which is sort of, not much mind-blowing, but it must sort of always look at the metaphysical, at the archetypal, and in this sense, partially at the metaphorical. And so there is the principle of masculinity and femininity. It's another matter, but it is also instantiated in sexual differences, right? And so there is a completion as well that occurs between men and women on the same identical pattern. Now, here we're talking alchemy in general. So matter, when used materia, represents merely a condition or modality of the spirit's existence. Again, I can't stress this enough. This could be an entire video explaining, destroying essentially any Cathar proposition of sort of evil spirit or bodies. Cathars properly rejected even the wood of the cross, denied the incarnation of Christ. This is properly trying to paralyze, to radically apostatize and sort of separate any kind of lower dimension from God. And how or why? Because you're scared of this God. You live in a nether condition by which you cannot afford to accept that you have the same capacity to elevate yourself. Interestingly enough, this is exactly what Catholicism states against any, idea of, but Catholicism actually also, just like Christianity at large, in an orthodox sense, simply says, we're separated from heaven. We can't do anything. We're bad. This is the Semitic superstition. It literally says that in incarnation that you can, it's the same Catholic traditional meaning of that, you can attain divinity at any moment, right? And true, of course, the divine medium. And so Christ, in this sense, could be just like, it is understood in a definitive sense, but it also, you should understand in that sense in a historical and super historical sense, rather than just, in fact, a chronological, consequential one, because of this human dispiriting. And it is a pretty serious, problem by the time, in fact, of the Common Era that overlaps with, in fact, the affirmation of Christianity itself, right? And it's rather so people that think that misunderstand Christian message if they think they're merely passive to whatever happens. This sort of, dictatorial attitude by the jealous skyfarer. That's not what anything about Christianity or Catholicism is particularly about. So when the spirit incorporates itself into the body, it unites with nothing alien to itself. There is not another God creating the body, right? And especially this instantiation is directly, absolutely fitting to the degree of that spiritual force. So to each its own, right? This is very notorious in alchemy, right? From caterpillar to ego, right? To each his own. There isn't such a thing like equality in the world. A genuine conjunction between body and soul consists solely in the internal practical actualization of this absence of difference between the two. This is truly understood, for example, when you realize the meaning of your guardian angel. What is it, really and historically, if not the messenger? And so the Holy Ghost, but modulated on you, right? So that's also overwhelmingly important. Philippe Rouillac, a 18th century Piedmontese Franciscan friar and alchemist in the Abrégé du Grand Œuvre, declares that, quote, the matter of the blessed stone is called Rebis because they are two things that are not two, right? The lower one was transcended by the former, and they're united in one. That's also why the moon before, the silver, the Virgin represent exactly this. It's like the transfigured soul of the hero. For example, if you've wondered the Filzia, the Victoria, the Nike, the Valkyrie, it's basically the same concept. It's yourself at the end of the day. It's the divine form of glory, the lowest, darkest, feminine aspects of your soul transcended into heavenly glory by your virility. So she's probably on the chariot of the winner with you. This is incredible and beautiful. There are some passages of the Aeneid, especially in the end. It's something sublime, truly sublime. And Pernetida, we mentioned before, because, quote, it is called Rebis because it makes of the two one. You see, by the way, the androgynous thing, there is the masculine and the feminine element, and it is metaphorical in that regard. So it's not like people think the androgynous is some sort of, non-binary, thing or whatever. Like it's actually the completion of masculinity and femininity. And Pernety says, indissolubly, although the two are only one same thing and one same matter. All right. And so here matter is understood in a sort of transfigured sense. This is from the Dictionnaire 427. Artephius, spelled differently, either with F or PH, pseudonymous 12th century alchemical author whose works, 12th century, derived from Arabic sources, because that was the age also where Europeans went over, especially to Spain, to get what, in fact, not even Arabs really read anymore. I always realized this, that the 12th century Renaissance was not like, Arabs or Byzantines exposing the primitive Western. The Westerners were already dramatically more advanced from an intellectual, scientific point of view. They were just knowing exactly what those texts were to go pick them in the East. We made lots of videos also in history of literature. Think about Petrus Lombardus. There are so many different examples. Well, Artephius puts this Book of Artephius 164 more plainly when discussing the reduction of body and spirit. Says, quote, to the same simplicity which will make them equal and similar, accomplished not through combining one thing with another, but within a state of immediacy. In fact, it says, spiritualizing the one and corporealizing the other, with, of course, the spirit triumphing. Or at least not necessarily, because, again, you can't simply fall as well. So at that point, it's not much of a triumph, but a domination in any case of the spirit over the matter. As long as your life is alive and you make it to sort of to have that spirit triumph together with your bodies, again, we've seen the soul came back united in splendor with the body. Made an entire video about the doctrine of afterlife, and this beautifully explains that. And the Book of Artephius adds in the same chapter, this would be impossible if they were not first separated, the doctrine of the two nature. This is, again, overwhelmingly fascinating. It's mind-blowing when you first get it. Petrus Bonnus, around 1330, 1339 in terms of actual production. This was a Lombard physician and alchemist whose major work is the Preziosa Margherita Novella. It refers to a subtlety that is almost beyond belief. Right? Subtilitas fere incredibilis is what we were saying before regarding the sort of perfect match, like this incredibly delicate but still sort of metaphysical, and to when describing this nature that is, quote, as spiritual as corporeal. By the way, these texts you can find in other secondary collections and so on, such as Manger, the Biblioteca Chemica Curiosa, etc. but it's incredibly relevant how persistent this knowledge is. As we've seen, we're looking at 14th century texts, 18th century ones. They all say the same identical thing. I can't stress this enough. We say this since the beginning of our History of Religion series. People do not have an idea of this being a thing, and it's easily verifiable under our eyes. It's there, microscopic, well documented, unequivocal, straightforward, without variations you would have to point out. And so, as such, we can elaborate the analogy already introduced in this way. Picture standing in front of an inscription written in a language you do not know. Right? It can function for you only as a collection of marks that you merely encounter and observe. It's like the voice and the word before. Right? It's like, I don't know, the higher spirit is not present, I don't know, in certain animals. You speak to them, they listen to the sound, but they do not understand what you're preferring. Hence also why the verbum, the logos, in Latin, in Greek, to describe God. Right? There's a very, very specific reason why that is the case. And it's all Catholic in nature, in the very meaning of these languages, since they're Indo-European root and part of the broader universal tradition. Now, the ordinary condition of the fixed is analogous. So in one's existence is this particular living organism, equipped with specific organs, abilities, potentials, and so on. To a vast extent, the being simply registers itself. So I am is also to be, constituting one reality, is what Descartes, regardless of his sort of, in fact, Cartesian, that's how it passed literally to because of him to the vision, sort of separates more absolutely the concept of a spiritual domain and a material domain, but also through the Cogito ergo sum basically declares the same concept. Remember, here we are in the same centuries in which that knowledge was well known, and so he was also expressing part of this. And I remember, I don't know, I always say that when I was like 4 or 5, I was playing with my toy soldiers at home in my room. And I had this thing, like I was thinking about existence, God, a thing, and it said, but, you know, I exist, I'm here, I perceive myself. And comprehending this, choosing it, means having the capacity to choose differently, representing something else entirely as well, because the soul has this capacity. We're not merely determined. We're not devoid of free will. We have attached to that divine power. And that's also why this thing is being dramatically pushed against by anyone who wants to basically sort of devoid oneself of responsibility and accepting the sinful condition in which they find themselves. Many scientists do so. There are actually lots of, again, we will see also some recent videos, lots of Christian scientists that actually tell you otherwise, but, and not merely in a notionistic or anecdotal sense, we will make names, but in this sense, I truly mean that it's all specifically described in traditional texts. Again, as I always say on this channel, I'm just an expounder of this. I'm not here to tell you, well, so you should believe in this or not. I'm just telling you that basically the entire world up to a few centuries ago, you would say, because then science magically popped up, believed this. How could they organically, precisely, and systematically believe this? Right? And or why did they believe that? Even admitting that it's all some sort of functional mechanism to sort of cope with life, etc. Like you may want to take note, you may want to appreciate, especially since, as you understand here, it's not like it's tied to anything particularly contentious. When the hard progressives say, well, the past sucked because, I don't know, of terrible obscurantistic idea. What is there obscurantistic in what we just read? It's obvious that there is an evil trying to dispel this stuff because they realize that using it could lead to greater power regardless of how this is actually achieved and that we can't understand. So remember, you do live in a bubble. You know, the Schwerpunkt is not a conspiracy theory channel. It's never going to be. The point is that we are responsible for what happened. It's not somebody else. It's you, right? And we can't simply study this through looking at specific texts like the ones we just described. Why shouldn't be aware about the wall? Why shouldn't we restore this knowledge as it was so clearly defined even by, Benedictine monks in the 18th century? Why shouldn't a person today believe that? I mean, it's not like you're necessarily better than an 18th century Benedictine. It's just like, everybody knew it at the time. It wasn't absolutely hidden in the way, again, this was something, Christianity was trying to chase. But it's there in the open. And it repeats itself in the centuries, in works of all kind. So going back to an analogy, if you think at instead understanding the language of description, as you can easily understand when you're reading anything at that point, or listening to my voice, at that point you not just gaze at it or listen to it, you read and grasp its meaning. And if you think about it, it's incredible, because if we were to describe this in merely material, physical terms, because, by the way, physis would be still body plus soul, right? You see how we degenerated our very language. Physical meaning just basically an equivalent to bodily or to material. And in a non sort of higher sense, just like physical as opposed to spiritual, whereas sort of would be bodily as opposed to spiritual, and even so just in metaphysical terms, not in a Gnostic and Cartesian sense. As you know, Cartesius, by the way, I liked very much Cartesius when I studied him, but as you know, he was also quite borderline. He was Catholic, but quite borderline Catholic. And there were similar things. Think about the Armenians, and that was exactly the time of also different political ideas connected with power, right, that agitated across sort of the confessional spectrum. Now, the marks of this language, we understand, serve as nothing more than a foundation, a mere indicator for an operation of your spirit. We've seen it also in the videos about Indo-European theology. When you really look at the meaning of the various phonemes, not just the religion as a whole is all deeply entwined. It's not like we have been trained to think in modern secular terms. There is a category, there is a separated set of ideas that are independent from one another, that just characterize themselves for no reason. These phonemes are expressing theological concepts that are deeply entwined and all sort of describe a specific function. But even linguistically speaking, you realize that many terms, when you look really at the root of the primigenial utterances, are also inextricably entwined, right? There are lots of false friends, but you realize that there are actually much more similarities the more you dig back, like you go at the linguistic root of the same sound that gave life to sort of different branches. And this is the same concept that were explained before in terms of the gradual degeneration also of meaning of the original tradition, just like the same alchemy did in the early modern age. And as much as people degenerate as long as generations pass. In any case, in their sort of mechanical, sort of material aspect, these indicators of language simply cease to exist once we understand the same language. The description might be erased, that you could recreate it. Once you have listened to what I told you here, you could repeat it. That's the form, that's the spirit, right? You could, in this sense, proceeding from your spirit to those marks rather than beginning and concluding with the marks themselves, as instead we're being trained to think when we go to school and learn, the ABC, the numbers and everything that in that sense we're said forcefully, no, it has nothing to do with a spirit, it has nothing to do with a ghost, it has nothing to do with metaphysics. No, it's just this plain material dead thing that you have to learn because it's just the only way you can put something together that works, because at the end of the day you have to die anyway, and there is nothing after that, right? Remember that. And remember, as this occurred to you in your mind, right, when the symbols were merely unintelligible to you, and they actually acquired meaning. Where did that happen? It happened in the symbol, or it happened in your mind? I would say that the latter is way more important. And so by applying this analogy, we can look at many different types of religious views. You can see literally like in Catholic, in Christian doctrine, the world as a word, right? God, Christ being the incarnated verbum, right, or logos that control that. The different semantics or same meanings that embrace this vast, encompass this vast roadmap to meaning, the ultimate meaning. Names of power as well. This is what the mantra, for example, is when you look at tantric teaching. Fundamentally, it's not just a mere repetition of an empty word, like, I don't know, think about the exocosm. So it is actually something that you use to extraneate yourself from the merely lower usage of that, in fact, the word itself, and understand the deeper meaning behind that by simply epurating it, as we said before, as the moonstone from its Saturnian-led instantiation. This is, alchemically speaking, the same exact dynamic. And so we will see better these realm of physical existence as much as its metaphysical one. We will see how something corporeal may convert into non-corporeal without losing its corporeal character. And so, as we understand, materially speaking, the marks undergo no alteration, whether they are discovered or inscribed mechanically, or whether they are intentionally set down as the liberated manifestation of spiritual content. Because what we see in this material world is merely transient, is a mere sort of veil, like a layer of something that a veil that is incredibly dissipating over time, and that can be just as a sacred symbol, through sacred symbols bringing us back to the higher meaning of the saint, that we can recognize through nature, through the physical world, in fact, because this concept is already written in us. Otherwise, we wouldn't be able to do anything. If you think about it physically speaking as well, like, how do we come to learn this stuff, right? It's not like science explains this, biology, evolution, but none of this has anything to do with conscience, with existence. Zero. Like, there is, in this strictly materialistically defined procedure, we're enforced, like, no reference whatsoever to the metaphysical dimension. And instead, we realize that the spiritual body, and so properly the mystical body, that is the more important compared to the material one, would appear completely identical externally to an ordinary body, though, provided one disregards naturally the diverse extraordinary capacities the former might display, and additionally provided one overlooks that body has shed its restriction to signifying merely an appearance within the exclusively human mode of being. This does still reflect some specific qualities, and that's, by the way, as humans, as how much we're stuck in our species. But remember that it's not much just like a physical transfiguration, but the miracle of transfiguration is also described in the Bible, etc. It's our illusion that we're so assuefacted to material change, because we fixate on that to us there can't be any change that is not merely material. And instead, even though this matter does change, it still appears in ways that are much more familiar to us than we think. And the miracle of transfiguration is truly like, most light. It's seeing this emanating from something like as energy, as power, from something we thought could not properly emanate it. And we could sort of draw very important parallelisms here, but they would, in any case, defy our more conventional scientific understanding, and or at least suggest something about the underlying sort of essence of the saying that would probably not be, the case of digressing on here, as much as we're not making a video about criticizing sort of science as we understand it. Again, all what we know in that sense is real. We are just looking at that because we can access through it the hyper real, which instead has been somehow barred from our education, from our standard way of looking at things. And that is also fair because it denounces a human condition. And so again, I don't have anything particular against science. I have something against any. I have everything against any category of person. As a matter of fact, I'm a historian, and I don't like historians. And the saying goes, I believe in medicine, but it's not like I'm very much into doctors. I believe, let's say, that the hyper real is more important than the real, right? So that's also what you strive for in sort of. Yeah, I have actually a lot of confidence, civilization speaking, also in mankind, right? So it's not like I distrust people, I'm phobic, I'm superstitious. Absolutely not. Actually, I trust people, but I also know, right, how difficult it is, in the sense that people are way more imperfect than you think, and especially when you sort of climb to higher standards for yourself, things appear a bit lame, from the outer side, for many different reasons. In any case, how much did this last? Because I make a tiny bit. It was fairly sort of normal in length, but it was a very important video to do. You understand how useful the stuff is, how truly, truly useful the stuff is. We couldn't do without it. Let me check here the hell is happening. Looking stuff from the window. Well, okay, it's even shorter than I thought. But again, as short as it is, I think it is, again, incredibly relevant, and we should definitely have more than a chat about this again. For today, however, I stop it here. I just hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, please share it. Otherwise, leave a like or subscribe to my channel if you're interested in my upcoming content. As always, I thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time and see you next time.